Hi, my name is Mario Loyola, and I'm Director of the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program at Florida International University, where I also teach environmental law. I'm thankful to the Volo Foundation for the opportunity to speak to you today for a few minutes about the enormous challenges facing a clean energy transition by the Paris targets of 2050, particularly in the United States. When President Biden first came to office, he pledged to decarbonize the electricity grid and get to net zero in the electricity grid by 2035. There were basically two pathways for accomplishing this, one by the regulatory route and the other by the legislative route. Unfortunately, both routes have substantially diminished in the past couple of years for a series of political factors and because of crucial Supreme Court rulings. In Congress, the high watermark was perhaps the cap and trade Waxman-Markey bill that came within one vote of passage in Congress in the first 2 years of President Obama's first term in office. After that, there was continual discussion of a carbon tax. But for a variety of political reasons, again, that carbon tax has never been brought up for a vote in any Congress, whether Republican or Democrat. Similarly, the idea of a clean electricity performance program or a clean electricity standard that would require utilities to shift to renewable sources from fossil fuel sources was included in various bills over the years and has also fallen short of passage for a variety of reasons, including opposition from the regulated community and how impractical it was to try to implement anything like a clean electricity performance program, given the problems of permitting, which I'm going to focus on in this discussion. The one thing that Congress has been able to do, playing to Congress's real strengths, is to borrow an exorbitant amount of money and throw it at special interest groups, chiefly the renewable energy lobby, for that sector to be able to develop renewable energy projects. But it's important to note that the limiting factor in the ability to build renewable energy structure was never money. There's essentially an infinite supply of capital in the private economy for these kinds of renewable infrastructure if the regulatory regime suggests that they can actually be built. Unfortunately, the regulatory regime is not very promising, and there are reasons to doubt whether many of these projects could even get their permits within a time horizon that would be relevant to investment decisions. So no matter how much money this is a problem that no matter how much money you throw at it, it can't get solved that way because these projects need to be able to get their permits. And without permitting reform, it will be very difficult for that to occur. On the regulatory side, the high watermark, again, was during the Obama administration, which came up with something called the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan would have used EPA's authority over coal plant emissions, essentially to force states to reorganize their electricity mix and transition away from first coal and eventually natural gas towards clean sources of energy, particularly renewables like solar and wind and hydropower. The problem with this particular plan was that and the problem with EPA regulation of greenhouse gases generally is that there's no easy fit within any of the major pollution control programs of the Clean Air Act for greenhouse gases. The Clean Air Act wasn't written for anything like greenhouse gases in mind. The Clean Air Act was written for specific industrial types of pollution that could be controlled through pollution control mechanisms at the source. And so what EPA was forced to do was use a little noticed provision that had existed since the original 1970 version of the Clean Air Act that had only been used a half dozen times for standards on solid waste incinerators and similar kind of miscellaneous things. And it used this particular provision to enact a series of sweeping standards, including a supposed best systems of emissions reduction for coal plants that extended all the way out to well beyond the fence line of the coal plants that were the regulated entities under this Clean Power Plan, all the way to the borders of the states, and encompassed the entire electricity mix and the entire economy of these states, including in the proposed Clean Power Plan what were called demand-side reductions in electricity usage, which means that the Environmental Protection Agency, as part of its power to regulate emissions from coal plants, was going to be telling residents in the states what temperature they could set their thermostat at, when they could run their appliances, and things like that. And among other things, all of these things were very dubious given the statutory authority that EPA actually had. And so the Clean Power Plan from the very beginning faced an enormous challenge to survive court review, because there were so many constitutional and statutory bases that could lead to its being vacated by a court. There were federalism problems, there were statutory problems, and in the end, in the case of West Virginia versus EPA, which was decided at the end of June of this year, 2022, the Supreme Court said that when an agency claims the power to regulate a large swath of the economy, it must be based on a delegation of authority that is clear and unmistakable from Congress. The agencies cannot, in the words of Justice Scalia, agencies cannot find elephants in mouse holes. And so this Supreme Court ruling is a historic ruling because it basically forecloses what was the widest avenue, the most feasible way for the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. So now you've got, in Congress, we've have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an enormous set of subsidies that are going to be going to the renewable energy sector. But that doesn't address the problem of how those projects can actually get their permits. And beyond that, Congress hasn't been able to enact a cap-and-trade bill. They haven't been able to do a carbon tax. They haven't been able to do a clean electricity performance program, a renewable electricity standard kind of a program. And on the regulatory side, it looks as if moving forward, EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases pursuant to the Clean Air Act will be considerably diminished as well. Now, before we get to the point of where does that leave us, I should like to add what is the main point of this discussion, which is that even if the regulatory route was open, or even if the legislative route was open, it might not make a difference, because there's an even bigger hurdle to the deployment of clean energy infrastructure on the scale that would be necessary to accommodate a clean energy transition by 2035. And that is the fact that only a small fraction of these projects that would be necessary could conceivably get their permits in time for construction to commence and end before 2035, or even before 2050, as the case may be. And so I'm going to go into what those problems are. They operate at a micro level, which is the challenges facing every particular project that needs a federal permit. And then I'm going to talk about the macro level, which is the enormous resource constraints, the enormous agency resources that are involved in this permitting and that are required for this to happen. Infrastructure that would have to be planned, sited, permitted, and built for a clean energy transition to occur. Most studies talk about roughly a terawatt of new renewable energy capacity additions to the electricity grid in the United States. To give people an idea of what that means, the total capacity of the U.S. electricity grid that exists today is about 1.1 terawatts. And so of which 60% roughly is fossil fuel, coal and natural gas, another 20% is nuclear, and the remaining 20% is mostly wind, a significant amount of hydropower, and about 3% solar, which is the fastest growing of the renewable energy mix. So in order to accomplish a clean energy transition, you would have to not just retire the 60% that is fossil fuel in the current electricity grid, which is about, say, 600 gigawatts, but you would have to accommodate all future expansions in demand for electricity, which all future expansions in total capacity that the economy might require through the addition of renewable sources only. And this is going to include the significant addition of capacity that would be required to accommodate electric vehicles if most Americans start driving electric vehicles. And for this reason, most estimates are that to achieve clean electricity by 2035, at least a terawatt of new renewable energy capacity would have to be added. And then there's some debate about whether you could really retire all fossil fuel from the electricity grid. The reason why that is open to doubt is because solar and wind are intermittent sources, which means that they're not always available when we need them. In particular, solar is available when the sun shines, and the sun shines 365 days in the western states. The sun shines in the middle of the day, which is not when electricity demand is highest. Electricity demand is highest in the mornings and in the evenings. And so we need to be able to backstop renewable energy from either coal or natural gas or nuclear. And there seems to be a ratio that is required for renewable energy to be for a grid that has a lot of renewable energy capacity on it to maintain stability and resilience, and to be able to adjust up and down as demand adjusts up and down. And it's about it seems to be somewhere in the region of like a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratio of renewable to that fossil fuel or nuclear dispatchable baseload generation. And so unless we double the nuclear fleet, unless we add 100 new reactors, which cannot be done in less than 15 years, it can't even be done in less than 20 years. So that's basically impossible on the nuclear front by 2035. We're going to have to keep several hundred gigawatts of fossil fuel sources on the electricity grid, and we're going to actually have to expand that fossil fuel capacity as we expand the renewable capacity, just because we need that fossil fuel capacity to be able to backstop and stabilize those intermittent sources of solar and wind that are the main sources of renewable energy. Okay, so in order to get to net zero by 2035, then, most of the studies that you'll see are talking about carbon capture, about things that, or selling renewable energy abroad, things that actually go in the other direction and help you get to net zero, despite the fact that you have this actually sizable fraction of fossil fuel generating capacity remaining on the grid. Just to avoid catastrophic blackouts and the kinds of things that are a danger to human health and welfare. Okay, so beyond that, as far as the renewable energy deployment that we're talking about, we would need if you look at most studies, the 10 or 15 most prominent studies of recent years are more or less in the same ballpark. You would probably need around 500 gigawatts of new solar, something similar, 500 gigawatts of new wind, around 200 gigawatts of nuclear, or 200 gigawatts of battery. This is the kind of mix that we're talking about. Just to think about what the challenges are there, let's look at the solar. If we need about 500 megawatts of new solar, if we need 500 gigawatts of new solar, a large utility scale solar plant can have a nameplate capacity of about 500 megawatts. So this means that a 500 gigawatt addition of solar energy would require about 1,000 utility scale solar plants. Each of those 500 megawatt solar plants takes up about 5,000 acres on average, depending on where it is. Sometimes it's 2,000, sometimes it's 7,000, somewhere in between. But let's say it's on the order of 5,000 acres for a 500 megawatt utility scale solar plant. That's 1,000 acres. That's 1,000 utility scale solar plants times 5,000 acres each, which adds up to 5 million acres, which is about the size of New Jersey. So needless to say, covering an area the size of New Jersey with solar panels would face major political and regulatory hurdles, even if you do it out west, where the population is much more sparse than on the East Coast. The major source of the hurdle is the National Environmental Policy Act. The National Environmental Policy Act requires in Section 1022C that whenever there's a proposed federal action that could significantly impact the environment, the agency has to prepare an environmental impact statement, which looks at alternatives to the proposed action, and then in a comparative way studies in great detail what the environmental impacts of the proposed action are and what the environmental impacts of the reasonable alternatives to the proposed action are. So for an environmental impact statement, as you can imagine, when the law first passed, the typical environmental impact statement could be 15 pages long or 20 pages long. It didn't take long for that to become a much longer exercise. And as a result of the fact that there's no substantial compliance standard with respect to NEPA reviews, and a permit or an environmental impact statement can get thrown out of court or vacated by a court over a minor omission. Agencies spend years and years and years and tens of thousands of staff hours trying to cross every T and dot every I. And at the end of the day, what they come up with is a 2,000, 5,000 page environmental impact statement that took years to produce, and that took millions of dollars to produce, and that has a litigation risk of 100%. Then they go to court and they find out whether they did it right, and they, about 30% of the time, are going to get thrown out of court. Now, the reason why that becomes a hurdle to the deployment of renewable energy infrastructure is that NEPA applies to everything that the federal government does itself, like a forest management plan or moving a division of the Army from one base to another. It also applies to every proposal to spend money, such as funding for transportation. All of that has to, if it has a significant impact on the environment, then those impacts need to be studied and reported in an environmental impact statement. And finally, any proposal for a permit, a federal permit, needs to be accompanied by an environmental impact statement if granting that permit would have a significant impact on the environment. In other words, if the project that is going to get the federal permit would have a significant impact on the environment, then the agency needs to prepare an environmental impact statement. So Going back to the case of solar, just to give an example, 500 megawatts of solar energy, you'd be talking about roughly 1,000 plants. Not all of those plants are going to require federal permits because not all of those plants need to be on federal land. Unlike transmission lines, which require a permit from Federal Energy Regulatory Commission if they cross state boundaries, or natural gas pipelines if they cross state boundaries, you don't necessarily, there's no federal law that says you need a permit for a solar project that meets certain conditions. But if the project is on federal land, then it does need a permit, and it does need an environmental impact statement. And the problem is that where the sun shines 365 days a year is in the western states. And all of that land out west, 93% of the land in the state of Nevada, for example, belongs to the federal government. Almost the vast majority of that belongs to the Bureau of Land Management, and so the Bureau of Land Management becomes the action agency that has to issue the permit. Once it has to issue a permit, then it has to determine whether an environmental impact statement is required. In the case of a solar project, the impact on the environment for a 10,000 acre solar project is always going to be significant. It's always going to require an environmental impact statement, and we're off to the races. Now, this process is a very lengthy process. It's a very costly process, and it's a very uncertain process for the project developers. The process starts with several years of pre-application, during which the project proponents, the developer of the solar project, for example, has to develop a series of resource reports, study of archaeological impacts, of biological impacts, geotechnical studies, what kind of soil is there beneath the project site, is it porous, what are the water characteristics, the drainage characteristics. All of these kinds of things and more have to be studied in enormous detail just to complete a permit application. Then after a year or two of development, that permit application is filed. If the agency has staff to look at it, they will look at it, and at some point they will issue a notice of intent to file an environmental impact statement, and that starts a process that involves open houses and public meetings. It's a process called scoping, and eventually we get to a draft environmental impact statement that has to be circulated. It's open for comment from the public, like as if it was a rulemaking, and then the agency has to study all of that material and eventually produce a final environmental impact statement. After it has produced the final environmental impact statement, at some point subsequently, it is supposed to issue the record of decision for the permit itself. And once it does that, construction can finally begin. So for any of these projects that are urgently required for the clean energy transition, they are many, many years away from being shovel ready. If you start today, they are many years away from being shovel ready. The process is inordinate, is very, very risky to capital formation. A single project application, again, for a solar project is a fairly simple thing compared to like a nuclear plant or something like that, okay? And for a solar project application, the project developers have to be prepared to sink $20 or $25 million into the application just in resource reports and all of the consultants that need to be hired and engineers that need to be hired and all the negotiations for the gen-ties to the transmission grid, where's the, who's going to buy this electricity. All of these things have to get figured out. And after all these tens of millions of dollars are spent and the application is filed at the agency, they have no idea if the agency is even going to call them back and tell them what's going on. And so it's a huge risk to capital formation, enormous uncertainty. That uncertainty obviously feeds through into the cost of capital. And so the public is paying an enormous premium to be able to cover the potentially catastrophic losses that attend on every single project application in the renewable energy sector. And that is the micro level problem. Once you take a step back from that micro level problem and multiply it by the 1,000 permit applications that you would be talking about, almost all of them out west, almost all of them in the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Land Management, you realize that the entire Bureau of Land Management is capable of processing maybe it has never, to my knowledge, the Bureau of Land Management has never issued more than 3 or 4 solar permit applications in a year. And you wouldn't be talking about 10 permits or 15 permits or 20 permits, which would be several multiples of the current pace of permitting at BLM. You would be talking about a much greater volume of permits than that. Because if you think about what would be required from now, we are almost at 2023. There are 12 years between now and 2035. Projects that enter pre-application in 2023 won't be filing their permit applications until 2025. And then after the permits are granted, then you still need several more years for construction. And you hope that there will be transmission lines that can be built quickly enough, or that are nearby, that you're going to be able to connect to in order for the solar energy to be able to get on the grid somewhere. And all of those are major questions, because much of the low-hanging fruit in terms of places where you can build a viable solar plant near an existing transmission line, those places, that's prime real estate, and it's disappearing very fast. And you're going to find that within a year or two, people are looking really far away from major metropolitan areas in the middle of absolute nowhere to build these solar plants, and then dedicated transmission lines are going to have to be built out to them. And linear projects are the most resource intensive of all from the point of view of NEPA, because every single mile of a linear project like a transmission line or a pipeline requires triggers new permit requirements and new environmental impacts, new sources of local opposition, all of which feeds into making the NEPA process quite onerous. Then you've got, now taking a step back and looking at the macro scale problem. As I mentioned, these agencies right now are operating. I've been in the federal government, and I can tell you for a fact that these agencies are operating at full capacity. From the Bureau of Land Management to the Corps of Engineers, to the Fish and Wildlife Service, to FERC, all of these agencies that are the major permit issuing agencies, there are 12 of them, say, across the federal government. Their staffs are working, full tilt to process these permit applications as quickly as they possibly can. The problem is that they can't take any chances on cutting corners. They can't cut corners, because if they do that, the permit will get blown up and all their work will be wasted. And what I mean to say, the permit getting blown up, I mean to say that the permit will get blown up by a court. When a court looks at it and finds that the record is insufficient, that permit will be vacated. I probably shouldn't use the expression blown up to describe that, but there we have it. The permit will be vacated, the environmental impact statement will be vacated, and agencies, in order to avoid that litigation risk, in order to avoid the chance of getting vacated, typically spend a very long time, tens of thousands of agency staff hours, making sure that they get everything absolutely right. And so, as a result, the overall capacity of the federal government to produce permits and conduct environmental reviews is severely constricted. The entire federal government is able to produce at most 70 or 80 environmental impact statements every year. As I said, the Bureau of Land Management, to my knowledge, has never issued 3 or 4 permit solar permit applications in a single year. It's never issued that many. And under current law, it's inconceivable. It's almost inconceivable that they could. These offices right now in the West are totally overwhelmed by just a few permit applications. And now, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and last year's infrastructure bill, they are facing a tsunami of permit applications. That tsunami is not going to help matters. They have to prioritize the one or two that they can work on at a time. The Inflation Reduction Act had added $1 billion to increase agency staff resources for the federal permitting workforce, a very highly specialized field that requires biologists and engineers and people who are technically conversant with the environmental impacts that often involve a very, very technical discussion. This $1 billion in enhanced agency resources would get the federal government maybe 500 or 600, 700 full-time equivalents added to the permitting workforce of somewhere between 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is. You can do the math. That's a few percentage points increase to a federal workforce that, in order to double or triple its pace of permitting, would have to double or triple in size. And so with this, I think we're starting to see the bigger picture of how difficult it would be for the entire federal government to be able to do the permits and environmental reviews of this gargantuan amount of renewable energy infrastructure. That's why the Aspen Institute issued a report in the spring of 2021 that said, and I quote, "Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is ecologically essential, technologically feasible, economically achievable, but procedurally impossible." That is what the authors of that particular report were talking about. Run down the gamut of the infrastructure that would be required for a clean energy transition by 2035, and you will find that there are permitting challenges, that the permitting challenges get worse the further you go down the line. We've been talking about solar project applications. Solar projects are the easiest ones, actually, above all. Solar and wind sightings, because windmills tend to be small and can be sited pretty much anywhere. But then you talk about nuclear. The permit process for a nuclear plant is 20 or 25 years. In theory, because there's reasons to doubt whether it's even possible to get the permit for an entirely new nuclear plant in the United States anymore. Very few nuclear plants have been built since the 1970s, since the 3 Mile Island accident in the 1970s led to much stricter permitting regulations for the nuclear industry. Something like 600,000 miles of transmission lines would be required. That is enough to go around the world, 25 times or something like that. 1 million miles of transmission lines would be required in the United States by 2050 for a clean energy transition. As I said, those new transmission line miles would confront opposition every step of the way, and that leads to So we have projects right now there's a project that's supposed to connect a renewable energy plant in Iowa to a grid in Wisconsin, and this project has been held up because an environmental advocacy group that claims standing on the basis that its members go boating on the lake in the state park are able to sue to prevent that interconnection from happening. Further west, a 750-mile transmission project has taken 15 years to get its permits. And obviously, if it takes 15 years just to get the permits, from the permit application to the granting of the permit, those projects cannot play a part in a clean energy transition by 2035. Now, why does the NEPA process take so long? The main reason why the NEPA process takes so long is litigation risk, as I mentioned earlier. Agencies are concerned that the permit application, that the permits will get vacated by courts, the environmental impact statements will get vacated by courts and remanded back to the agency for further work, and so they put an enormous amount of time and effort into bulletproofing the environmental impact statements, which consumes a huge amount of agency staff resources. Part of the problem here, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's no substantial performance standard. The agencies are supposed to be subject to an arbitrary and capricious standard under the Administrative Procedure Act, Section 706, which says you can courts should set aside an agency action if it's found to be arbitrary and capricious. But courts are very smart, and they can not only get around the clear meaning of a statute, but can turn it upside down, and that's what they've done in this case with something called hard look review. And with hard look review, it turns out that if the agency skipped some detail that the court considers important, that the court would have liked to see explored at length in the record, then the court will say that the agency action was arbitrary and capricious because the agency didn't take a hard look at the evidence before it. And so the combination of hard look and the lack of a substantial performance standard means that the agency's environmental review can be 99.99999% correct. But if it doesn't discuss the one butterfly that somebody mentioned during scoping, or something like that, the entire permit could get vacated. Courts have bent over backwards to pave the way for environmental advocacy groups in particular as litigants, because environmental advocacy groups are often, are representing the public interest. The environment doesn't have anybody to defend it, and so courts relax bonding requirements, standing requirements, these kinds of procedural protections that defendants normally enjoy when the plaintiff is an environmental advocacy group. But this has created a real problematic situation because courts are operating on the unstated assumption, I would say, maybe the unconscious assumption, that while environmental advocacy groups represent the public interest, federal agencies do not, or at least they're de facto treated as if they do not. And to my mind, that is a very, very serious problem because some of these projects have national importance. And in some of these projects, anything that's related to clean energy has national importance. We've committed to the Paris Agreement to making this transition happen. But in the NEPA process, there's no way to give voice to national priorities, unfortunately, in the system that the federal government has now, which is one of the most important areas for reform of this system. The system represents the triumph of local opposition, in particular NIMBYism, or if you like, banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, or not in my backyard. The triumph of these local parochial interests over national interests is the system that has been developed over the course of 50 years on the basis of the National Environmental Policy Act, unfortunately. And every single project everywhere, no matter how necessary for a clean energy transition, is going to generate local opposition and is going to generate opposition from environmental advocacy groups. The problems go on and on. Another major problem with this system is that the processes by which federal agencies grant these permits are all disconnected. So if I want to develop a natural gas pipeline or a transmission line, that entire project needs a FERC permit under the Natural Gas Act or the Federal Power Act, as the case may be. Then, if the transmission line crosses BLM land, it needs a BLM permit. If it crosses Forest Service land, it needs a Forest Service permit. That's Department of Agriculture. If it crosses a stream that constitutes waters of the United States, now it needs a Section 404 permit under the Clean Water Act. The list goes on and on. All along the way, it's going to be trampling on habitat of a potentially protected species. Now we need a biological opinion from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, making sure that any losses of wildlife are avoided, minimized, or mitigated. The permit requirements accumulate at every step of the way, and these processes are totally disconnected. If you need all of the permits that I just mentioned, those agencies don't work together to produce that permit, except under the construct of the lead agency under the NEPA regulations of the Council on Environmental Quality, which is like an interagency working group. There's no single agency that can issue a decision. So all of these reforms that were tried in the Obama administration and the Trump administration and the current administration to make the entire federal government operate as if it was one coordinated, unified permitting process. You can try to get it to look that way, you can try to get it to smell that way and walk that way, but it's just not. It can't be a single unified permitting process unless Congress changes the system, because an executive agency or the president acting under their own authority cannot change the statutory authorities that agencies exercise when they grant permits and conduct NEPA reviews. And the system that Congress has set up has essentially turned each of these agencies into a separate government for purposes of granting these permits and granting these environmental reviews, and conducting the environmental reviews. So what are the areas for reform? I would say there's a couple of important areas for reform moving forward. Sooner or later, and I just want to stress, we just had a bill that was made part of the continuing resolution to keep the government open in Congress. This was the agreement that Senator Manchin and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer reached as part of their deal on the Inflation Reduction Act and those subsidies. Senator Manchin was able to secure a commitment to doing permitting reform. In the end, the permitting reform that emerged was very, what James Q. Wilson would call client politics. It was very responsive to narrow, concentrated special interests, in particular pipeline and transmission interests. You could see that their lobbyists had an impact on shaping that bill. But the broader reforms that would be necessary to accomplish a clean energy transition, that has not been done yet. And I want to stress that Americans are on the precipice of a period of energy scarcity. Energy scarcity, even fossil fuel energy scarcity, is going to make it much more difficult to achieve a clean energy transition for the reasons that I said before, and also for the fact that when gasoline is $2 a gallon, it's pretty low on people's, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But when gasoline is $5 a gallon, people don't want to talk about clean energy. They want to talk about how you're going to get gasoline down. And so we've seen that climate change, as inflation has risen, climate change has fallen in people's priorities, and that's another way in which, paradoxically, a clean energy transition requires, at least in the near term, abundant, reliable sources of all energy. I would say, including fossil energy. We're on the precipice of energy scarcity. It's increasingly clear that we are not going to be able to accomplish our clean energy goals, and the message is that under the current system, nobody can get what they need. Nobody can get what they need. Of course, there's a cottage industry of vested interest, like there is in all of these situations. These environmental advocacy groups have developed a whole business model where they are able to challenge permits over very minor omissions. It's full employment for environmental lawyers like me. Who make a lot of money doing this kind of work, but other than those who benefit directly from the system, the interests that are vested in the current system, the system is good for nobody, and sooner or later the American people are going to wake up to the fact that they can have clean energy. They could have much more modern infrastructure. They can have much more abundant energy, much more affordable energy. They can have all of these things if Congress would only reform the system for permits and environmental reviews. And those reforms are going to have to be really comprehensive, not tinkering at the margins, to accomplish their mission. And so what would need to happen? You would need to reduce the litigation risk that agencies face when they conduct these reviews. You need to establish some kind of substantial performance standard so that agencies who do, the purpose of NEPA is to inform the decision maker. The infinite detail does not inform the decision maker. That sometimes the decision of whether or not to grant a permit is something that the agency head, who is the one that has to make the decision, isn't going to spend thousands of hours on, and so they're not going to read a 5,000 or 10,000 page environmental impact statement. So there has to be some limit on the amount of detail that agencies have to go into in these environmental impact statements that's commensurate to the importance of that detail to the agency decision maker. The timing of the process has to be made much more predictable so that the project developers are in control of the clock. Just imagine if you moved to a new place, but you didn't know if you could get a driver's license this year or next. That might weigh heavily on your decision to move from one state to another. If you thought that you might have to be on foot or driving illegally for a year or two. Project developers face a similar situation. We need to be able to make the timing much more predictable. We have to. One way to do that is for Congress to specify specific areas, specific kinds of projects where agencies can grant a programmatic review. Instead of doing a review for every single project that gets filed, the agency should be able to say, we're going to give a permit to these 200 projects or these 100 projects as a program, or even, as is the case under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, to be able to have nationwide general permits that project developers can just use and avail themselves of by filing, a simple form and then moving right away to construction. Finally, there should be a unified process where agencies, where the federal government can designate projects of national importance. And then have a single agency that preempts states' authorities and that speaks for the entire federal government, because once again, it's going to be very important to reduce uncertainty and delay in this entire process. Now, why doesn't this happen? This doesn't happen because this hasn't happened so far because the American public hasn't woken up to the fact of how easily they could have this clean infrastructure, modern infrastructure. But this is a major competitive disadvantage internationally. The United States is going to start falling behind countries like China, which paradoxically, even though it's a communist country, the regulatory burden is actually much lighter in China than it is in the United States for this kind of thing. And so China is moving with enormous speed to construct far more modern infrastructure than we have in the United States, even though in that case they are constructing coal plants, not solar plants, or coal plants more than solar plants. So Congress has to go back to the era when it could put together a coalition for sweeping reforms of a system that's clearly not working. This system is not well understood. People have, it's very important to raise awareness of these problems so that people can understand that you can throw $1 trillion or $2 trillion or $3 trillion at renewable energy infrastructure. If they can't get their permits, those projects cannot get built. And under the current system, they cannot get their permits. Under the current system, we'd be lucky if the renewable energy infrastructure that we would need for a clean energy transition by 2035, we'd be lucky if even 1/10 of those projects can get their permits in time for construction by 2035. So if this is really code red for humanity, and it's urgent that we make a clean energy transition, these obstacles are very serious. They're not going away, and they're not going away until the American public starts to focus on them. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any comments that any of you may have, and thank you very much to the Volo Foundation for this opportunity.